The last rays of sun bled across the sky, casting long streaks of crimson and gold over the dry hills of the Arizona frontier. The land looked tired, worn, like the face of an old drifter who had seen too many winters. Elias Turner pulled the saddle cinch tight on his horse, Dusty, and gave the animal a gentle pat. The day had been long, fixing fences, hauling water, and tending to the cattle that grazed on the sparse grass of his small ranch. His back ached, and his hands were raw from the work, but the quiet of dusk had always been his solace. It was the only time the world seemed to pause long enough to let him breathe. He adjusted his hat, glanced toward the horizon, and prepared to head inside for a simple supper of beans and bread. That was when he heard it. At first it was so faint he thought it was just the wind whispering through the mesquite branches, but then clearer this time, like a desperate prayer carried on the evening air. "Please help us, our ma's dying." Elias froze. The voice was small, trembling, and unmistakably human. Slowly he turned, scanning the fence line where the shadows of dusk bled into the silver light of the coming moon. And there they were. Two girls stood side by side, pressed against the wooden posts of his outer corral. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, thin as reeds, with long black hair hanging in tangled strands over their shoulders. Their dark eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, glistened in the fading light. The worn moccasins on their feet were caked in dust, and their small hands clutched at the fence as if it were the last barrier keeping them from collapsing entirely. Twin Apache girls. Elias's chest tightened. He hadn't seen an Apache child this close in years. The tension between settlers and the tribes still lingered in every corner of this land, like the smoke of an old fire that refused to die out. Most white ranchers would have raised their rifles before raising a hand in mercy. But these were children trembling, desperate, their faces pale beneath the dirt and sweat. He took a cautious step toward them. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low, wary. The taller of the two, her lips cracked, voice nearly gone, spoke again. "Our ma? She's sick. Please, mister, help us." Elias felt the ground tilt beneath him. For a man who had lived alone for more years than he cared to count, who had built walls of silence around his heart after losing his wife, this was the last thing he expected. 2 Apache girls on his land, begging him for help. He glanced toward the horizon, instinctively checking for movement. It could be a trap. He knew stories, how sometimes bandits used children as bait, luring an unsuspecting rancher into the hills where an ambush awaited. The world was cruel enough for that to be true. His hand hovered near the revolver on his hip, but then he looked at their eyes again. One of the girls swayed where she stood, her knees buckling. The younger grabbed her arm, trying to hold her upright. Their voices were thin as spider silk, their bodies trembling like leaves about to fall. This wasn't a trick. This was desperation. Elias's mind churned. He had spent so long surviving on his own that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed. The ache in his chest reminded him of nights long past, when he used to listen for another voice in the house. A laugh, the soft hum of his wife moving through the kitchen, all gone now, leaving him with only cattle and silence. And now, out of nowhere, 2 children on his land, pleading for their mother's life. He swallowed hard. "Where is she?" he asked. The younger one pointed north, toward the dark rise of the hills. Her hand trembled as she raised it. "Not far, just over there, but we can't carry her. We need help." The words cut deep, simple and raw. Elias knew what it meant to watch someone you love suffer, powerless to change it. He had lived that with his wife. It was a wound that never healed, only scabbed over with time and solitude. Dusty pawed at the ground, sensing his master's hesitation. The air had grown heavy, the silence stretching thin between man and children. Finally, Elias exhaled. He stepped closer, kneeling slightly to meet their eyes. "You girls got names?" The taller one whispered, "Naya, the other added. Lena? He nodded slowly, the names anchoring them as more than strangers, more than shadows in the dusk. They were real, flesh and blood. Someone's daughters. Elias's jaw tightened. Against every instinct honed by years of mistrust and survival, against the voice in his head warning him of danger, he felt the weight of their plea settle on his shoulders. "All right," he muttered, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I'll help." The relief that flickered across their faces was like watching a dying fire catch a breath of wind. Naya sagged against the fence, and Lena clutched her tighter, whispering something in Apache Elias couldn't understand. He glanced up at the darkening sky. The moon was climbing silver and cold, casting its pale light across the barren land. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing. His quiet night had just ended, and nothing about tomorrow would be the same. Elias moved closer, the crunch of his boots on dry earth loud in the silence. The girls hardly flinched, too drained to react, their wide eyes tracking his every step. As the last light of the sun slid beneath the jagged horizon, the world around them became a wash of blue shadows and silver moonlight. His hand lingered near his revolver out of habit, but his gaze fixed on the older girl's wrist. Something about the way she held herself, half swaying, half fighting to stay upright, made him notice the scrap of cloth tied there. A frayed band of faded fabric knotted loosely, its edges worn thin as if it had been cherished far too long. He stopped dead in his tracks. The embroidery. His breath caught in his throat. Tiny, careful stitches formed the outline of a wild rose, the same wild rose his late wife Mary had stitched into countless handkerchiefs during the long winters when they still had hope of building a family together. He had watched her fingers move with quiet patience, sewing by the firelight, her hair catching the glow, her humming soft and low. That memory was etched so deep in him that even now, years later, the sight of those delicate patterns felt like being struck. He blinked hard, his jaw tightening. It can't be. Mary had been gone for nearly a decade, taken by fever that swept through the settlement like wildfire. Elias had buried her himself beneath the lone cottonwood by the creek, laying one of her embroidered handkerchiefs across her folded hands before the earth closed in. He had kept another in his chest drawer all these years, yellowed now with time, a relic of love and loss. There should have been no others, and yet, here on the wrist of a half-starved Apache girl was the same pattern, the same threadwork, even the uneven corner where Mary's hand had slipped a stitch. The world seemed to tilt. His mind reeled, questions crashing like thunder. How could this be? Had the cloth been stolen, bartered, or an idea so wild it made his stomach churn? Did this child somehow carry a piece of Mary's life that had traveled farther than he could fathom? The girl swayed again, her knees buckling. Elias snapped from his thoughts, just in time to lunge forward and catch her by the shoulders. Her skin was fever-warm beneath his calloused palms, her breath shallow and quick. "Easy now," he muttered, lowering her gently to the ground. Her sister dropped to her knees beside them, clutching her hand, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. She hasn't eaten since yesterday," the younger one whispered, her voice cracking. "She tried to keep walking for Ma, but she—" The words dissolved into sobs. Elias looked down at the embroidered cloth again, his chest tightening with something more than confusion now. The girl's lips were pale, her body trembling. She was on the edge of collapse, and the other was little better. He had half a mind to demand answers. Where did they get this cloth? Who gave it to them? What did it mean? But the urgency in the moment left no room. Whatever truth lay behind that embroidery would have to wait. Right now, survival came first. "Stay still," he told them, pulling the canteen from his belt. He tipped it carefully to the older girl's lips, letting the water trickle past. She coughed weakly, then swallowed, her eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat before rolling back in exhaustion. The younger girl, Lena, she'd said her name was, watched with desperate hope, clutching her sister's wrist as if to anchor her to the earth. Elias saw her thumb brush over the embroidered cloth, like a charm against despair. He couldn't tear his eyes from it. That pattern gnawed at him, refusing to let go. The stitches pulled threads of memory he had buried deep, unraveling his silence, his walls. It was as if Mary herself had whispered from the grave, reaching across years and loss, pulling him toward these children with invisible hands. He shook his head hard, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't the time to drown in ghosts. The girl was slipping away, and he had no medicine here, no food save for what little he kept in the house. "Come on," he growled to himself, lifting her up into his arms. She was light as a sack of feathers, bones sharp beneath his grip. He turned to Lena, who stared at him, uncertain, as if afraid he might suddenly change his mind. "Get up," Elias said firmly. "We're going inside. She won't last out here." Lena scrambled to her feet, eyes still wet, nodding rapidly. She followed close as Elias carried the girl across the yard toward his cabin. The air grew colder with each step, the night wrapping around them. In the distance, coyotes yipped and wailed, the eerie chorus of the desert night. The land felt too vast, too merciless, but for the first time in years, Elias carried something precious that wasn't cattle or tools. He carried life that hung by a thread, fragile, breakable. Inside the cabin, he laid the girl on his bedroll near the fire pit, stoking the flames until they crackled with warmth. Lena hovered near, wringing her hands, whispering soft words in Apache over her sister's still form. Elias pulled out what little food he had, a piece of dried venison, some beans, and set it to warm. As he worked, his eyes strayed again to the cloth, that damned embroidery. Memories pushed in, relentless. Mary's laughter, the way she used to brush the hair from her face with the back of her hand, needles still dancing in her fingers. How she had dreamed of children filling their home with noise and chaos, dreams Elias had buried with her. Now, in the firelight, 2 children had arrived on his doorstep, carrying not only desperation, but a fragment of Mary herself. Coincidence or something more? He clenched his jaw, torn between wanting answers and fearing them. The land was harsh, and it had no patience for miracles, and yet as he looked at the faint rise and fall of the girl's chest, at Lena's anxious eyes, he couldn't shake the thought that fate had drawn them together for a reason. Elias Turner, the lonely rancher, who had sworn never again to open his heart, now found himself standing at the edge of something larger, something he didn't understand, and he knew deep down there would be no turning back. The firelight in his cabin flickered across the faces of the girls, painting their hollow cheeks with trembling gold. The older one still lay weak, drifting in and out of shallow breaths, while the younger, Lena, watched Elias with eyes wide-eyed as the moon. Outside, the coyotes had quieted, leaving only the hiss of the wind through the sagebrush and the creak of the wooden beams that held his life together. Elias stood, heavy hands braced on the table, his heart thundering against his ribs. He had seen hunger before, had seen sickness take its grip. He knew that if he left the girls here, one might not wake by morning. Their mother, somewhere out in the hills, would fare even worse. But every instinct screamed caution. This land was not kind. Bandits lurked in the passes, men who had no conscience, only greed. He had heard stories of white men dressing as Apache to spring ambushes on ranchers too soft-hearted to resist the sight of starving children. He had even seen the aftermath. Bodies stripped of boots and bullets, wagons torched, the ground stained dark. His fingers brushed the handle of his revolver. He had lived this long because he had learned to doubt, to weigh every decision like it might cost his life. And yet, as he looked again at Lena, clutching her sister's wrist, whispering quiet prayers in Apache, the doubt warred with something stronger, The sound of the older girl's labored breathing cut through him. Each gasp echoed the memory of his wife's last night. The fever that burned her from the inside, the way her small hands trembled as he tried and failed to cool her skin. He had been powerless then, powerless to stop the sickness, powerless to save her. That helplessness had shaped his silence, carved the hard lines in his face. Now here it was again, staring back at him, but this time maybe he wasn't powerless. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his hat, and strode across the cabin. Dusty, his horse, stamped nervously outside, sensing his master's unrest. Elias knelt and lifted the frail body of the older girl into his arms. She stirred faintly, lips parting in a whisper, too weak to understand. Lena scrambled after him, clutching the hem of his coat as though afraid he might vanish into the night. Elias tied the canteen tight, checked the rifle slung across his back, and in one smooth motion hoisted the older girl up onto Dusty's saddle. She slumped forward, her head against the leather horn. He placed Lena up behind her, steadying the pair with a rough but steady hand. "Hold on to her," Elias said, voice low but firm. Lena nodded quickly, wrapping her thin arms around her sister. She looked at Elias with eyes too old for her years, eyes that begged him not to change his mind. For a moment Elias hesitated. The open desert lay ahead, bathed in silver moonlight. The hills to the north rose like jagged teeth, dark and dangerous. He knew them well enough to know he was heading into a hornet's nest. The safe choice would be to stay put, keep his head down, pretend he'd never heard the whisper in the night. But the sound of the girl's quiet sobbing cut through the silence, and with that sound came a flood of something he thought long dead inside him: compassion. He swung into the saddle behind them, his body tense, eyes sharp on the horizon. "Hang on," he muttered, more to himself than to them. With a gentle kick, Dusty surged forward, hooves pounding the dry earth. The ranch fell away behind them, swallowed by the darkness. Ahead, the desert stretched vast and endless, its silence broken only by the steady rhythm of horse and rider, the occasional call of an owl, and the uneven breaths of the girl slumped against the saddle horn. The moon climbed higher, pale and cold, throwing long shadows across the land. Sagebrush and rock rose like ghosts, and every ridge felt like the edge of a trap. Elias's eyes darted across the landscape, scanning for movement, glints of metal, silhouettes of men lying in wait. His hand never strayed far from the revolver at his hip. The girls clung tight, silent now except for the occasional whimper. Lena pressed her face against her sister's shoulder, whispering soft reassurances in a language Elias didn't understand. But he didn't need the words. He knew the sound. It was the same tone Mary used when she had tried to soothe him in his darkest moments. They crested a ridge, and for a heartbeat, Elias slowed. The desert spread below like an ocean of silver, the hills beyond jagged and unforgiving. Somewhere out there lay their mother, sick and waiting. Somewhere out there, too, could be men with rifles, waiting for him to ride into their jaws. Elias swallowed hard, tasting the dry grit of the night air. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. His heart pounded as he spurred Dusty onward, deeper into the unknown. The night had grown heavier, the desert sky scattered with stars that looked close enough to touch. Dusty's hooves pounded against the hard-packed ground, the rhythm echoing through Elias's bones as he pushed the horse forward. Hours stretched thin and endless, each mile cloaked in uncertainty. The cool night air bit at his face, but sweat clung to his brow from the tension that wound tighter with every step into the unknown. The girls were silent now, except for the occasional moan from Naya, the older one, who lay weak in the saddle horn's grip. Lena, pressed against her back, held her fiercely, whispering words in Apache that Elias couldn't understand. He didn't need the translation. The sound of love, of fear, carried well enough in any tongue. And then he saw it. At first just a pinprick of orange against the dark rise of the hills. Then, as they drew closer, the faint flicker of firelight revealed itself, shimmering, unsteady, but real. A camp, a beacon. Elias pulled Dusty to a slower gait, his body stiffening. Every muscle went taut, his eyes narrowed, sweeping the shadows beyond the fire. The desert was full of illusions, and more than once, a flickering flame had turned out to be nothing but a lure for the careless. The flame danced on the slope of a low hill, just beyond a cluster of stunted mesquite trees. Elias's hand slipped to the butt of his revolver, thumb resting near the hammer. He had seen too much to ride blindly into light without expecting darkness waiting behind it. The girls stirred. Lena lifted her head, and when her eyes caught the glow, they widened. Her voice broke free in a rush. "Ma, we're back!" Her cry pierced the night, high and raw, carrying across the barren land. Naya moaned faintly at the sound, as if the word itself gave her one last ounce of strength. Elias cursed under his breath. The cry would travel far. If anyone else was out there, bandits, bounty hunters, men who thrived on blood, it would be as good as a signal flare. "Quiet," he hissed, his voice sharp but edged with fear rather than anger. Lena clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, but tears streamed freely down her cheeks. They drew nearer, and the fire resolved into the heart of a small camp. A crude Apache lodge stood at the center, its walls of hide and wood patched but sturdy. Smoke trailed faintly from a vent at the top, curling into the sky like a prayer. The fire outside burned low, embers pulsing red, as if struggling to stay alive. Elias slowed Dusty to a halt just beyond the clearing. He scanned every corner, every shadow, his ears straining for the snap of a twig or the scrape of a boot. Nothing but silence met him, silence and the faint crackle of the fire. The girl shifted restlessly, eager, desperate. "Please," Lena begged, her voice trembling. "She's inside. Ma is inside." Elias drew in a breath so deep it seemed to scrape his lungs raw. His hand gripped the revolver tighter, thumb brushing the cold steel. He had seen ambushes set up like this before, helpless souls used as bait, fire left burning to lure the weary. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but then he looked again at the girls. Their faces, gaunt and lined with dust, glowed with fragile hope in the firelight. They weren't thinking of traps. They weren't thinking of him at all. Their world was narrowed to that lodge, to the promise that their mother still breathed within. Elias's chest ached. Once, long ago, he too had run toward a house lit with firelight, desperate to find life where death was already waiting. That memory of Mary's fever, the night he lost her, pressed on him like a phantom weight. He slid off Dusty, boots landing softly in the dirt. "Stay close," he muttered. The girls scrambled down after him. Lena grabbed Naya's arm, trying to help her stand, though her sister's legs wobbled like reeds in the wind. Together they staggered forward, calling out again. "Ma, we're back." Elias followed a step behind, revolver drawn now, his gaze cutting across every shadow. His heart hammered against his ribs as the flap of the lodge stirred faintly in the breeze. He expected movement, an armed man stepping out, a rifle raised, the sudden crack of violence. Instead, only silence answered. He swallowed hard, his pulse roaring in his ears. Every step toward the lodge felt like a step toward a cliff he couldn't see the bottom of. The girls stumbled ahead, their cries raw and urgent. Elias hesitated at the threshold. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed against the hide flap, revolver at the ready. The fire behind them hissed and popped, the night holding its breath. And then, with a deep inhale that seemed to drain the weight of his soul, Elias stepped inside. His heart pounded, his eyes strained against the sudden dimness. The smell hit him first, smoke, sickness, and the faint copper tang of blood. And then he saw her. On a bed of blankets near the far wall, a woman lay still, her face drawn and pale beneath the glow of a dying ember fire. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath a battle. The girls shrieked with relief. "Ma!" they cried, collapsing at her side. Their voices broke, half joy, half despair. Elias stood frozen, revolver still in hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on him until his knees nearly buckled. He had stepped into a place where life and death hung by a thread, where every instinct screamed danger, but something deeper whispered fate. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud as a drum. And he knew, whatever waited in this lodge, whatever truth it held, his life would never again be the same. The lodge smelled of sickness. Smoke clung to the hides, but beneath it was the unmistakable sourness of fever, the heavy air of a body burning itself out from the inside. Elias stepped further in, his boots silent on the dirt floor, his revolver still raised, though his hand now trembled with something that wasn't just caution. On a bed of deer-hide and worn blankets lay the woman the girls had called Ma. Her skin gleamed with sweat, her dark hair tangled across her face. The rise and fall of her chest was shallow, fragile like a candle flame about to gutter out, yet when her eyes opened, clouded with illness, but sharp for a fleeting moment, they found Elias. Recognition flashed there, not confusion, not fear, recognition. Her lips moved, cracked and dry, but her voice still carried. "I know you," she whispered, her words breaking against the weight of her breath. "You, the man who saved my brother at Dry Creek." Elias froze, his revolver lowered slowly, the name slamming into him like a hammer. Dry Creek, years ago, a skirmish that had left men on both sides bloodied. He remembered it vividly, the heat, the gunfire echoing through the canyon, the dust choking the air. He had stumbled across a wounded Apache boy that day, barely more than a teenager, bleeding out under the rocks. He could have left him there. By all rights, by all the codes whispered among settlers, he should have. But something in that boy's eyes, the terror of dying alone, had stopped him. Elias had dragged him to shade, bound his wound with a strip of his own shirt, and left water within reach before slipping away. He had never known if the boy survived. Until now, the woman, Ayasha, her daughters had called her, reached weakly for Elias's sleeve. Her hand was frail, bones sharp against his rough skin. "You saved him," she rasped, tears shining in the corners of her eyes. "You saved my brother. He told us of the white man who gave him life." Elias's throat worked as if he'd swallowed sand. Fate was a cruel beast, circling back when you least expected it. What were the chances that he, a rancher trying to live forgotten, would be dragged again into the path of the very family tied to that act of mercy so many years ago? Behind him, Lena knelt by her mother's side, clutching her hand. Naya lay slumped against her shoulder, too weak to speak, but her eyes bright with relief at seeing their mother again. The scene cut Elias to the quick, children clinging to a mother already halfway into the grave, begging her to stay as he once had begged Mary to hold on. Ayasha coughed, a rattling sound that shook her entire body. Elias instinctively knelt beside her, pulling a canteen from his belt. He pressed it to her lips, and she drank, trembling, before sinking back with a sigh that sounded both grateful and resigned. "You came," she whispered to the girls, her voice barely a breath. "You brought him here." "Ma, please," Lena sobbed, pressing her forehead against her mother's arm. "Don't leave us. We found help. He'll help you." Ayasha's eyes drifted again to Elias. She searched him with a look that pierced deeper than he liked. "You are not here by chance," she murmured, Tom. And for an instant, something like peace touched her face. "The circle turns, always." Elias sat back on his heels, rattled. He had seen death many times, but something about the way she spoke, like she was already standing with one foot in another world, made the lodge feel smaller, heavier. He wanted to tell her to save her strength, to keep fighting, but the words stuck, because in her gaze he saw what he had seen in Mary's eyes during those last hours, the knowledge that no fight remained. He hated it, hated the helplessness, hated the way life drained from someone you couldn't bear to lose. The girl's sobs filled the room, raw and unbroken, pulling at scars Elias thought had hardened long ago. He looked at Ayasha again, forcing himself to steady. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Her breath came ragged, but she answered. "Fever. It came swift, like fire on the wind. Took others too. Left me with no strength. My daughters. They walked to find help. Brave girls." Her hand twitched toward them, pride mingling with sorrow. Elias's jaw tightened. He had no medicine strong enough, no miracle to give. All he could do was listen, watch, and remember, and that knowledge hollowed him out. The fire in the center of the lodge crackled faintly, throwing shadows against the hide walls. Outside, the wind carried the lonely cry of a coyote, distant but haunting. Elias felt the world closing in, as if nature itself leaned closer to witness this final chapter. Ayasha's hand still clutched his sleeve. Her eyes, though dull, held steady on his face. "Fate brought you back," she whispered, "not to save me, but for them." Her gaze slid to her daughters. Elias followed it, his throat thick. Two girls, fragile as saplings in the wind, clinging to the only anchor they had ever known. If Ayasha's words proved true, by dawn they would be orphans. Elias swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. He wasn't a man meant to care for anyone anymore. His world was one of silence and cattle, not the cries of children. And yet here they were, pressed into his hands by something greater than chance. Ayasha coughed again, her body racked, then slumped back with a groan. Her breathing grew slower, each inhale a battle. Elias knew the signs. The sands were slipping fast. And as the weight of the moment settled on him, he realized his life was about to be tied irrevocably to these children and the secrets their mother still held. The circle had indeed turned, dragging him into its orbit once more. The dying crackle of the fire filled the lodge with shifting shadows. Elias knelt beside Ayasha, fumbling through the small pouch at his belt, where he kept a few dried herbs and roots. Nothing worth more than stalling time, but he couldn't just stand idle while the woman gasped for air. His rough hands searched through the familiar shapes by memory: sage, wild mint, bark he'd stripped from a tree up near the ridge. Then his gaze drifted past the bed of deer hide, past the flicker of orange flame licking the wall, and he froze. In the far corner of the lodge, half swallowed by darkness, something stirred. Elias squinted, leaning closer. At first he thought it was just a shadow, a trick of light and fever. But no. There, against the wall, bound at the wrists and ankles, lay a man. His skin was pale in the firelight, far lighter than Ayasha's, and blood had soaked through the shirt at his side, spreading dark stains into the dirt beneath him. Elias's stomach clenched. A white man. The figure moaned faintly, head lolling forward. His face was streaked with grime, but even through to the dirt, Elias could see he was no Apache. His beard was patchy, his hair long and matted, his features those of a drifter or outlaw, and he was tied, ropes digging into flesh, arms wrenched cruelly behind him. The air seemed to shift. Every instinct Elias had sharpened at once. He yanked his revolver from its holster, the metal glinting in the firelight. His voice came low, harsh, like gravel ground beneath a boot. "What in God's name is this?" The girl shrieked. Naya, weak as she was, whimpered and buried her face in Lena's shoulder. Lina threw herself in front of her sister, arms outstretched, eyes wide with terror. "No, don't! Please don't shoot!" Elias's aim never wavered, though his heart hammered in from his chest. The man on the floor groaned again, head lifting just enough for Elias to see the haunted look in his eyes. Not the look of a stranger caught in a fight, not the look of a traveler who had stumbled into the wrong lodge. It was the look of someone cornered, guilty, broken. Elias's mind whirled. What was a wounded white man doing here in an Apache lodge, tied up like an animal? Why hadn't the girls said a word? Why hadn't Ayesha mentioned it in her dying breaths? He took a step closer, revolver leveled. "Talk!" he barked. "Now! Who is he?" The girls sobbed harder. Lena's small voice cracked as she stammered, "Psst, please! He's not bad! Don't hurt him!" Elias's jaw tightened. Not bad? A man tied like a hog in the corner of a dying woman's home? His gut told him different. The wounded man coughed, spitting blood into the dirt. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, ragged from thirst and pain. You don't understand," Elias snarled. "Then make me." But before the man could say another word, Naya lifted her head. Her small, fever-weak voice carried through the lodge with a desperation that cut deeper than any bullet. "He's ours. Don't hurt him, mister. Please, he's our pup." The words slammed into Elias like a hammer blow. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling and the rasp of Ayesha's labored breaths. Elias's revolver wavered, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. He looked at the girls, their tear-streaked faces lit by firelight. He looked at the man bound and bleeding, and he looked at Ayesha, who hadn't denied a word. Something in his chest twisted, old wounds tearing open. His vision blurred with memories of Mary, of the night fever stole her away, of the handkerchief she had sewn with care. Now here he was, staring at two half-starved Apache girls, claiming that this broken, bloodied man was their father. His grip on the revolver tightened again. A father or a killer? Elias's voice came out harsh, cracked with disbelief. "Their pa, explain." But no explanation came, only sobs from the children, and the low groan of the bound man. Ayesha stirred faintly on her bed, her lips parting as though she might speak, but the effort stole what little breath she had left. Her chest rose and fell with rattling gasps. Elias felt the air closing in around him, the walls of the lodge pressing tighter. Everything he thought he knew about this night, the desperate girls, the dying mother, the pull of fate, shifted beneath him like sand in a storm. The revolver in his hand suddenly felt like a question he couldn't answer. The lodge was heavy with silence, the kind that presses into the ears and makes a man feel as though the world itself is holding its breath. The fire hissed low, throwing red sparks that danced against the hide walls. Elias stood rigid, revolver still in hand, his eyes locked on the pale figure tied in the corner. The girls clung to each other, sobbing, their small bodies trembling as if the weight of their pleas alone might hold him back from pulling the trigger. Then, with a sound barely louder than the crackle of the fire, Ayesha stirred. Her hand lifted weakly, shaking as if the very act of reaching had drained the last of her strength. Her fingers brushed against Elias's arm. He looked down, startled, and saw her eyes open, clouded with fever, but piercing with a clarity that did not belong to the dying. She struggled for breath, her chest rattling with the effort, but her gaze never left his. "Listen," she rasped. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a blade. Elias crouched beside her, leaning close to catch each fragile word. Her hand tightened on his wrist with surprising strength. She turned her head slowly toward the bound man in the shadows. Her lips trembled, and then she spoke, every syllable dragging pain across her face. "He killed my husband." The word struck the air like a gunshot. Elias froze. His revolver rose again by instinct, aimed squarely at the man. Rage twisted in his gut. Not his rage, but a second-hand fury, a fire borrowed from Ayesha's confession. He had suspected this stranger carried darkness, but to hear it laid bare, to know blood had been spilled, a life stolen, It confirmed every instinct, but Ayesha was not finished. Her next words came slow, broken by coughs that left crimson at the corner of her lips. Her hand clutched Elias's sleeve as though dragging the truth out of her body. "Yet he is," she shuddered, her eyes sliding toward the girls. "Their father." The air in the lodge collapsed. Elias felt his balance sway, as if the ground itself had shifted under his boots. He glanced from Ayesha's fever-stricken face to the bound man in the corner, then to the girls, their wide eyes shimmering with tears, their small hands clutching each other's shoulders. The truth hung there, raw and jagged, tearing at him from every side, the girl's father and their mother's betrayer. Elias's revolver trembled in his grip. His mind roared with conflict, the echo of Mary's face flashing before him, her gentle hands, the life they had dreamed of but never built. How could he reconcile this, that these children he had carried through the night, these fragile souls who reminded him of everything he had lost, were bound to a man whose hands were soaked in blood? Ayesha coughed violently, and Elias caught her, supporting her frail shoulders. She clung to him with surprising force, dragging him down until her face was inches from his. Her voice came in a whisper, raw with truth. "Do not judge them for him," she pleaded, her eyes boring into his. "They are innocent. His sins are his. Their blood is both. Do not let hatred take them too." Her grip faltered, but she forced one last breath. "Promise me, rancher, promise. You'll protect them." Elias's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked down at her, torn between fury and sorrow. He had buried his wife with a handkerchief embroidered by her own hand. He had buried his heart alongside her, and now fate had placed before him a dying woman, asking him to take on a burden that felt impossible, protecting the daughters of a man who had murdered her husband. The man in the corner moaned faintly, his head lifting just enough for Elias to see the glimmer of shame in his eyes. Not defiance, not pride, shame, and that shamed look sickened Elias more than anger ever could. The girls clung tighter, sensing the moment unraveling. "Please," Lena cried, her voice breaking, "don't let Ma go alone. Don't let us go alone." Elias's chest constricted. He had promised himself years ago he would never let another life depend on him. He had failed once. He would not risk failing again. And yet, how could he walk away? Ayesha's hand slipped from his sleeve, falling limp against the hide blanket. Her eyes fluttered shut, her lips parting as though she meant to say more, but no sound came. Her chest rose once, twice, and then settled into a rhythm so faint Elias wasn't sure if it remained at all. The girls screamed her name, collapsing against her still body. Their cries filled the lodge, raw and endless. Elias staggered back, the revolver lowering as though it had turned to iron in his hand. He looked at the bound man, at the daughters, at the lifeless body on the blankets. Fate had twisted its knife deep, and now Elias Turner stood at a crossroads no bullet could solve. To kill the guilty and orphan the innocent, or to honor a dying woman's plea and carry a weight heavier than any he'd borne before. The girls clung to him with all the desperation of the dying. Their small hands gripped his coat, their tear-streaked faces lifted to his with pleading eyes. Lena's voice cracked, thin but unyielding. "Please, save Pa. Even if he's bad, even if he's done wrong, he's still our father." Her words trembled in the smoke-heavy air, hanging there like a sentence Elias couldn't escape. He felt Naya's weak fingers tugging at him too, her body shaking with fever, her voice so faint it was little more than a whisper echoing her sister's plea. Elias looked down at them, and in that moment the years melted away. He saw not Apache girls clinging to his coat, but the ghosts of dreams he'd once had. He saw Mary, his Mary, smiling as she spoke of children filling their home, her eyes alight with hope. He remembered the day they planted the cottonwood by the creek, swearing it would grow tall as their family someday. That tree still stood, but the family never had. Fever had taken her before they could ever cradle a child together. Now 2 children, not his own, looked up at him with the same desperate eyes he had once imagined in his dreams. They were begging for something he wasn't sure he had left to give. His revolver felt heavier than iron in his hand. It dragged at his arm, accusing, relentless. His mind roared with reason. Don't do it. Don't get involved. This man is poison. He killed. He destroyed. If you save him, you'll pay the price. And yet his heart whispered back, the girls are innocent. They'll carry this weight whether you act or not. Do you leave them or carry it with them? He shut his eyes, his chest heaving as though every breath cost him dearly. The lodge pressed close, the shadows shifting with the fire, the smell of blood and smoke filling his lungs. He wanted to shut it all out, to retreat back to the silence of his ranch, to the comfort of solitude. Solitude never begged. Solitude never wept. Solitude never forced him to choose between justice and mercy. But he couldn't shut them out. He opened his eyes and saw Lena's face again, so young yet marked with the hard lines of survival. Saw Naya's trembling lips, fever burning through her but still holding on. And he saw Mary, standing behind them in his mind's eye, as if her spirit had risen from the grave to force his hand. "Damn it," he muttered, voice raw. The man in the corner stirred, lifting his head with effort. His face, pale and bloodied, turned toward the girls. Shame was etched deep in his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came, only a strangled groan. The sight of him ignited fury in Elias again. This was the man who had stolen Ayesha's husband, stolen her peace, left these children torn between love and hatred. And now Elias was meant to choose whether he lived or died. His hand shook. The revolver aimed, then dipped, then rose again. The weight of choice was crushing. "Why me?" Elias hissed under his breath, though whether he spoke to God, to fate, or to Mary's ghost, he didn't know. The lodge offered no answer, only the crackle of fire and the quiet sobs of children. Elias staggered back a step, running a trembling hand through his hair. He felt cornered not by men with rifles, but by his own soul. His life had been one long path of solitude, a wall built high around his grief, and now, in a single night, 2 girls and a dying mother had torn that wall down with bare hands. He could not save everyone. He had learned that the hard way, but could he damn children to suffer for the sins of their father? The revolver slipped from his grasp, falling heavy to the dirt floor. The thud rang like thunder in the stillness. The girls gasped, then clutched him tighter, sobbing into his coat, as though the sound alone had granted them hope. Elias's shoulders sagged. His voice cracked as he muttered, "God help me, I can't kill him, not tonight." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, like defeat and surrender all at once. His logic screamed he had chosen wrong, that mercy would cost him dearly. But the warmth of the girl's grip told him his heart had, for once, chosen something human. Still, torment twisted inside him. He hadn't forgiven. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't decided what would come next. All he knew was that for this moment, in this lodge filled with smoke and sorrow, he would not be the man who pulled the trigger. Outside, the night stirred. A low wind swept over the hills, rattling the hides of the lodge, carrying with it the distant echo of hooves, faint but real. Elias stiffened, every muscle tensing again. The world would not grant him peace for long. The silence of the lodge broke all at once. First came the sound, a faint rhythmic pounding that made the earth itself tremble. Hooves, many of them. Elias's head snapped up, instincts firing before a thought. His hand dropped to the revolver lying in the dirt, where he had let it fall only moments ago. He scooped it up, the weight now cold but steady in his grip. The girls froze. Even in their grief, they recognized the sound, Their eyes widened, glistening with fresh terror. Outside, through the thin hide walls, the flicker of orange light cut against the night. Torches, more than one. The glow moved in jagged patterns, swaying with the gait of mounted men. Then came the voices, rough, drunken, thick, carried clear through the desert air. "Bring him out," one bellowed. "We know he's here." Another followed, sharper, greedy. "That bastard's worth $1,000 in gold, dead or alive." Elias's jaw tightened. So that was it. The stranger tied in the corner. He wasn't just a killer. He was wanted, hunted. Men didn't ride through the desert at night with torches unless the prize was worth dying for. Inside the lodge, the wounded man stirred, his face twisting with pain. His lips moved, a hoarse whisper escaping. They've been after me for weeks." His eyes flicked toward Elias, wide with something Elias hated to see. Fear. The girls clung to Elias, trembling. Lena shook her head violently, tears spilling. "No! Don't let them take him, please, he's all we have." Elias's stomach knotted. His gaze darted between the flap of the lodge, where the torchlight grew brighter, the man bound in ropes, and the two children clutching his coat. His heart pounded hard, every beat echoing the thunder of hooves outside. He knew these men, not by name but by type. Bounty hunters, wolves who prowled the edge of law, loyal only to coin. They would not care about children. They would not care about promises. They would drag the man out and string him up if they didn't shoot him where he lay. And if Elias stood in their way, he would be swept aside or buried alongside him. His hand tightened on the revolver. He'd been in gunfights before. He knew the odds when outnumbered. And he knew these odds were bad. Outside, the riders drew closer, their torches throwing monstrous shadows against the hides of the lodge. Hooves struck dirt with a thunder that made the girls cry out and cling tighter. Then came the demand again, louder, right outside the flap. "Hand him over, rancher. We know you got him in there. Don't make us come in and take him." The voice was hard, merciless, carrying the weight of men who had nothing to lose and gold to gain. Elias glanced at the man in the corner. Blood stained his shirt, his face pale as bone. Yet there was no mistaking the truth. The hunters weren't lying. He was worth money. $1,000 in gold was more than Elias could dream of. In 10 years of hard ranching, enough to buy more land, enough to leave this lonely life behind, enough to bury the ghosts of Mary and start again. The thought came unbidden, and it sickened him, because right beside it came another. If he gave the man up, the girls would lose their father, their only blood left. They would be orphans before dawn. The revolver shook slightly in his hand. His throat burned as if he'd swallowed ash. The flap of the lodge stirred as one of the hunters shoved against it. "Last chance, rancher," he barked. "Give me the bastard or we light this place up and burn you all out." Elias moved without thinking. He stepped in front of the girls, shielding them with his body, revolver leveled at the door. The firelight inside painted him in a red glow, his shadow stretching long across the floor. His voice came low, rough as gravel, but steady. "You come in here, you'll wish you hadn't." For a moment, silence. The hunters outside muttered to one another, weighing his words, his tone. Then came laughter, hard, cruel, the kind that told him they weren't afraid. "Don't play hero, old man," one sneered. "That scum ain't worth your hide. Step aside and live, or die with him. Your choice." Elias's breath came heavy. His finger tightened on the trigger. His heart roared in his ears. Behind him, Lena tugged at his coat again, voice breaking. "Please, Mr. Elias, don't give him up. Please, he's all we have." The weight of her words crushed him. Elias closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He saw Mary again, her smile, the life they had never lived. He felt the warmth of the girls against his back, the fragile trust they had placed in him. And he heard Ayesha's last plea echoing in his mind. "Promise me. Protect them." When he opened his eyes again, his decision was made. Not with his head, not with logic, but with the part of him that had once loved and lost. He raised the revolver higher, aimed square at the flap. His voice rang out, iron hard. "You want him," Elias growled. "You'll have to come through me first." The night held its breath. Outside, the torches swayed as the hunters shifted in their saddles. The silence stretched taut as a wire ready to snap. And Elias knew by dawn blood would stain the dirt one way or another. Gunfire split the silence like thunder tearing open the skippe. The first shot came from outside, tearing through the hide wall of the lodge and burying itself in the dirt. The girls screamed, clinging tighter to Elias's coat as he threw himself over them. But Elias had already moved. With one hand he yanked the wounded man up by the ropes, dragging him across the floor. "You'll stand," Elias growled through gritted teeth, "and you'll fight. For once in your damned life, you'll fight for something other than yourself." The man staggered, legs buckling under the strain. His face twisted in pain, but in his eyes flickered something Elias hadn't expected. Shame, maybe even resolve. Elias shoved a rifle into his bound hands, cutting the ropes with his hunting knife in one swift slash. "Prove yourself," Elias barked, shoving him toward the entrance, "or die trying." The lodge flap burst open, torchlight flooding the space. A bounty hunter lunged in, shotgun raised. Elias fired first. The blast lit the lodge, the hunter crashing backward into the dirt, his torch spilling embers that hissed against the ground. More poured in behind him. Their shouts filled the air, curses thick with greed. Gunpowder smoke choked the space, the acrid sting burning Elias's eyes. As he spun and fired again, the recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he didn't falter. "Stay down," he barked at the girls, forcing them behind a pile of blankets near the fire. Naya clutched Lena, both trembling, but their wide eyes never left him. The bound man, bloody, pale, but now free, lifted the rifle with shaking hands. For a moment Elias thought he'd collapse. But then the man steadied, teeth gritted, and fired. The shot echoed like judgment, slamming into a bounty hunter at the doorway, sending him crashing against the post. Outside, horses screamed and men cursed. Bullets tore through the hides, showering dirt and sparks. Elias ducked low, returning fire, his revolver spitting flame in the smoky dark. "Circle left," one hunter shouted outside. "Smoke 'em out." "Not tonight," Elias muttered, firing again. The fight raged, each second stretching like hours. Elias moved with the instinct of a man who had seen too many battles, each shot calculated, precise. But he was outnumbered. For every hunter that fell, another pressed forward. Their greed burned hotter than their fear. The man beside him groaned with each movement, but he fought, clumsy, desperate, but he fought. His face twisted not with rage, but with something heavier, the crushing weight of debt he could never repay. "Keep firing," Elias shouted. Another torch flew through the lodge flap, crashing against the wall. Flames licked up the hide, smoke billowing. The girls shrieked, clutching each other as the fire spread. Elias's gut clenched. They were being trapped, cornered in fire and lead. He spun, grabbing the girls, pulling them close against his chest. With his free hand, he fired blindly toward the entrance, the gun's report deafening in the enclosed space. A hunter fell, clutching his chest, blood spraying across the dirt floor. The air grew thick, the heat pressing down as flames climbed higher. The lodge groaned, wood beams crackling under the weight of fire. The man stumbled forward, rifle empty, now, and looked at Elias. His voice was hoarse but urgent. "Get them out! I'll hold them!" "No!" Elias snapped, shoving another pistol into his hand. "You want redemption? You fight beside me. You die for them if you have to. But you won't run." The man's jaw clenched. For the first time, Elias saw no cowardice in him, only grim acceptance. Together they turned back toward the flap. Smoke choked their lungs. Fire lit the night, and still the bounty hunters pressed on. Elias fired until the revolver clicked empty, then swung it like a hammer against the skull of a man who charged too close. Blood sprayed, bone cracked. The girls screamed again, covering their ears, as chaos swallowed the world. Elias kicked a fallen hunter's shotgun free, scooping it up and blasting into the night. The flash lit the hillside beyond, revealing more riders circling, their torches blazing like hellfire. His heart hammered. They were outnumbered, cornered, doomed. And still he fought, not for himself, not for the man beside him, for the girls, for the promise he had made to their mother, for Mary, whose ghost watched him now with eyes full of judgment and sorrow. "Stay with me," he roared at the man, their backs pressed together as bullets tore through the lodge. The man grunted in reply, firing again, stumbling but standing. The desert night howled with fire and gunpowder. Elias felt time collapse into a single truth. This would end in blood one way or another. He shielded the girls with his body, every muscle burning, his heart a drum of fury and resolve. Smoke blinded him, gunfire deafened him, but he stood, because to fall meant to leave them alone, and that he could not do. The gunfight roared on, every shot a prayer, every cry a curse, until the line between life and death blurred into nothing but survival. The night roared like a furnace, every second consumed by fire, smoke, and the thunder of guns. Elias's body felt heavy, his arm numb from the recoil of shot after shot. His lungs burned with smoke as the lodge crackled around them, the hides sagging under the lick of flames. He crouched low, pulling the girls close, his revolver nearly empty. Bullets tore through the walls. Each one sang past his ears so close he could feel the whisper of death brushing his skin. The bounty hunters outside shouted in chaos, their torches casting hellish light that made the desert glow red and orange. Elias gritted his teeth. He was nearly spent. His legs wobbled under him, sweat and soot streaking his face. For every man he felled, 3 more seemed to rise from the darkness. His heart told him he couldn't hold much longer. A scream split the air. Lena clutched her sister tighter as Naya's weak body trembled against her. A shot rang out sharp and clean, aimed straight through the smoking flap of the lodge, straight at the girls. Elias turned, but he was too slow. His revolver was empty, his body sluggish from exhaustion. In that instant, he thought it was the end. And then it happened. The bound man, the girl's father, stumbled forward from the shadows, his body jerking alive with one last surge of strength. His face twisted with pain, but his eyes blazed with something new, something fierce. He hurled himself between the girls and the bullet, his body taking the impact with a sickening crack. The shot struck deep. He staggered, choking, and then collapsed against the dirt, the torchlight painting his blood a dark, glistening red. The world seemed to freeze. The bounty hunters outside whooped, thinking they'd scored a kill. The girls screamed in unison, their voices raw, shaking the very air. Elias's breath caught in his chest as he stared at the man sprawled before him, the daughter's father, the killer, the fugitive. He lay there in the dirt, gasping, the crimson stain spreading fast across his chest. His trembling hand reached toward the girls, not for a weapon, not for escape, but for them. His lips parted, blood bubbling at the corners, but his voice still carried in the haze of battle. "Forgive, a wicked man." The words came like a prayer, like the confession of a soul stripped bare. His eyes haunted hollow, locked on the girls. For a moment, all the greed, the crime, the sin of his life seemed to fall away, leaving nothing but a father's last plea. The girls sobbed, clutching his hands, pressing their tiny palms against his cooling skin. "Pa, no, don't leave us," Lena wailed, her voice cracking. Naya tried to speak, but only choked sobs came, her fevered body collapsing over him. Elias knelt, revolver forgotten, watching a man die who only minutes ago he might have killed himself. His mind reeled, torn between rage and a strange, unbearable sorrow. This was the man who had shattered Ayesha's life, who had murdered her husband, and yet, in his final breath, he had done what Elias himself could not. stood between death and the innocent. The sacrifice twisted something deep inside Elias, breaking a knot he hadn't known he still carried. For years he had told himself there was no redemption, no salvation, no mercy left in this world. But here, in blood and fire, a sinner had chosen to die for love. Outside, the bounty hunters cursed. Their prize was slipping away, dying before they could drag him to claim their gold. Shots rattled against the lodge, but their fury now sounded more desperate than assured. Elias rose, rage burning bright in his chest. He stepped over the man's body, placing himself squarely before the girls. His revolver clicked empty, but his hands found the shotgun fallen from a dead hunter. He racked it hard, the sound echoing like thunder. His voice tore through the night. "He's gone. You want more blood, you'll have to take mine." The bounty hunters hesitated. The fire inside the lodge roared higher, smoke pouring into the night sky, and in the chaos, doubt flickered in their ranks. They had lost men already. See, the girl's father was bleeding out, their bounty fading. Was it worth more blood? Elias's stance dared them to find out. But when the smoke cleared for a moment, all he saw was their torches retreating, their curses fading into the desert. One by one, their hoofbeats rolled away into the night. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fire and the sobs of the children. Elias turned back, his chest heaving. The man lay still now, his last breath gone, his eyes glazed in the firelight. His hand remained in his daughter's grasp, their small fingers refusing to let go even as the warmth drained away. Elias knelt beside them, a weight pressing deep into his heart. He wanted to despise the man, to curse his memory, but the image of his sacrifice burned too excited and too bright. He had died to shield them. That truth would not leave Elias. The girls wept until their voices broke, clinging to their father's body as though they could anchor him to the world. Elias put a hand on their shoulders, his voice low, rough as stone. "He's gone, girls, but he didn't leave you with nothing. He gave you his last breath to keep you safe." They cried harder, but they listened, and in that moment Elias Turner, the lonely rancher who had sworn off ties, felt something shift. The ghosts of his past whispered against his soul, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe even in a land soaked with blood, sacrifice could carve the path to redemption. The desert night fell silent at last. No gunfire, no torches, no shouts of greedy men echoing across the hills. Only the hiss of fire dying into embers and the faint cries of two children left clinging to what remained of their world. Elias stood in the doorway of the half-collapsed lodge, shotgun still heavy in his hand. The bounty hunters had fled into the night, their hoofbeats swallowed by the horizon. He could feel the tremor of exhaustion in his body, the ache in his bones. From every shot fired, every breath dragged through smoke. Yet what pressed on him most wasn't the weight of battle. It was the weight of what came after. Behind him, the lodge was quiet now. The girls had cried themselves nearly voiceless, their small bodies curled against their father's lifeless chest, until even grief surrendered to exhaustion. Ayesha lay still on her deer-hide bed, her face finally calm, as though death had granted her a peace life never allowed. Elias lowered the shotgun. Slowly, he walked back inside. He knelt between the two bodies, the mother who had pleaded with her last breath, and the man who had spent his last breath shielding the daughters he had once abandoned. Different paths, but both ending in the same silence. He looked at the girls, fragile and trembling in the firelight. For them, the silence would not end. It would stretch into tomorrow and the next day and all the years ahead, unless someone carried them through it. Elias swallowed hard, the memories of Mary pressing in on him, the way she had spoken of children, the way she had dreamed of life loud with laughter instead of quiet with sorrow. He had buried those dreams long ago. Yet here they were, staring back at him through the tear-streaked faces of Naya and Lena. By dawn he knew they would be his. The first light came slowly, a pale gray at the edge of the horizon, then streaks of red and gold bleeding across the prairie. Elias worked through the night in silence. He dug with his own hands, the cold earth unforgiving, each stroke of the shovel cutting deep into his shoulders. Sweat and soot stung his eyes, but he didn't stop. He had buried one love beneath a cottonwood before. He knew how to bury again. At the base of an old oak tree, strong and weathered, he laid Ayesha to rest. Her daughters pressed flowers into her hands, scraps of desert blooms they had gathered in trembling fists as the sky lightened. Then beside her, Elias lowered the body of the man who had died a sinner but finished as something else. A father who gave his life in the one way that mattered. Elias stood back, chest heaving, and pressed his hat against his chest. The girls clutched each other, their tears falling silent now, the dawn softening their grief into something gentler, if not lighter. No words could fix it. No prayer would change it. But the earth took the bodies, and the sky promised another day. That was enough. When the graves were filled and the fire of night finally died to ash, Elias turned to the girls. They looked so small in the rising light, framed against the endless prairie. Naya leaned weakly against her sister, her fever not yet broken, her body frail. Lena held her up with all the strength she had, her eyes rimmed red but fierce, protective beyond her years. Elias crouched before them, his voice low, rough as the land itself. "You're not alone anymore." For a long moment they stared at him, uncertain, their grief and fear still too fresh. Then Lena reached out, clutching the front of his coat. Her lips trembled as she whispered a single word. "Pa." It hit him like a bullet. That word, one he had thought buried with Mary, one he had never imagined hearing again, slammed into his chest with the force of everything he had lost. His throat tightened, his vision blurred, but he didn't pull away. Naya echoed her sister, her voice weak but clear. "Pa." Elias bowed his head, his hat shadowing his face, but inside, something broke and something healed at the same time. The walls he had built around his heart cracked wide open, and for the first time in years, he let the warmth in. He pulled the girls against him, his rough arms wrapping them close, shielding them as the sun rose high enough to paint the prairie in fire and gold. They trembled in his embrace, but they held on tight, as though afraid the moment might slip away. Elias whispered, his voice steady now, "I'll take you home." The journey back to the ranch was quiet. Dusty carried the three of them slowly, his hooves steady on the hardened ground. Behind them the oak trees stood tall over the fresh graves, the desert wind already scattering petals across the mounds of earth. Ahead the land stretched wide and endless, but for the first time Elias didn't see emptiness. He saw promise. The ranch had been a prison of silence for years, a monument to solitude, but he imagined it now filled with the sound of two girls' laughter, of voices rising and falling, of footsteps racing across wooden floors. The ghosts of the past would always linger, but they would no longer be the only company he kept. The prairie sun blazed higher, chasing the last of the night. Elias tightened his arms around the children and rode on, a man no longer bound by loneliness. A new dawn had come, not just for the land, but for him.